Thanks a lot for coming. We're here today to talk about our project called URIPlay, which is about giving URIs that work nicely to playable media, so radio and TV. So hopefully fairly self-explanatory at that level. This is a sort of overview diagram that explains a bit about what we're trying to do. Essentially, we're building a piece of infrastructure, what we, as an analogy, call DNS for media. The idea is, if you were Tim Berners-Lee and you wanted to build Amazon, but no one had invented DNS yet, you might just say, well, before I can get on and make a decent web shop, no one's going to type in all these numbers. I need something which looks up from the name to the number. So we're trying to do something a bit like that in terms of making it easier to find media content.
I'm sorry, is there a presentation? Is there a slide?
Yes.
Yeah, we can't see it. Can you push presentation on your remote, the blue button?
It was on presentation.
It was on presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, this has been set up.
Do you hit it again?
And we're back.
This is the wonders of technology.
Oh, that's better.
Okay,
Thank
we
you.
can see it now.
Cool, you can see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So, this page is a description of essentially the world that we see ourselves living in and what it is that we're trying to do. We see today as an environment with pretty complicated media distribution and silos of different technologies with the same content but quite different ways of distribution. So in the good old days, we just had broadcast, radio and television platforms. Relatively recently and jolly helpfully, we now get a lot of television over the web as well, whether via a broadcaster's website, via a website such as YouTube, a video blog website, whatever. There's a range of applications that are on the internet, but not on the web as well. And then finally, and I think quite importantly, many of us will have copies of much of this content at home, whether it's on a PVR, on something like a media center PC, to pick out a sort of quite consumer-oriented piece of software, or just a plain home server. So you've got all this choice about where to see content, but it's all split into these silos and fairly complicated. And when we first started thinking about what we could do interestingly in this space, we thought of a whole load of interesting applications around simple media distribution and found it quite hard to tie together the content from all those different places and figured that a bit of infrastructure in the middle might just be helpful. And so that's this URIPlay block in the middle that we're talking about. Now, what physically we're doing there is three things. First of all, we're doing a very simple design in terms of an XML data format and some URLs that you can hit to get things, an API if you like. Number two, we're making a first version of that, a first server that runs those things, that produces and receives that XML and responds to those URLs. And then finally, we're doing some crawlers that pull data from all that stuff on the left-hand side into this first server that we're using. It's worth saying none of this is for consumers. This is all a developer service. So we see ourselves as a conduit between some developers that might have data and stick it into this central thing, and some developers who'd like to make applications, who'd like a nice simple view of all the data across all those different things. Sample applications that we see. At the most simple, wouldn't it be great to have a permanent link that tells you all the information about where you can watch a television show as it moves between rights windows, as it moves between locations and different software? Wouldn't it be great if that link was smart enough to know, hey, he's in the UK rather than the US? I won't direct you to a broadcaster site in the US that won't work, but only to the UK one. And then some things you could do that's more social, or just simply producing a nice, simple television interface that pulls in all that stuff. So that's the overview of what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to step through the first section. Lee's going to talk a lot about the technical aspect of what we're doing in the middle, and then George and I will talk about some of the applications that come from the centre. So we are, Lee and I, the founders of a small UK startup called MetaBroadcast that's working on this. George comes from the BBC, and the BBC have been incredibly supportive of us in this, both in terms of providing some financial support for some of our costs as we get going on this, but also in terms of providing data and expertise and comments on what a broadcaster would want in this. We're also building a growing working group, and we'll give details of that later, but we're actively looking for people to get involved in this as developers who might have data, who might like data, or just think this is a good thing to have around. So television is a wonderful thing. I love television. I actually love radio as well, but saying broadcasting doesn't have quite the same ring to it. Television has just a fantastic history that's about at least three things. Firstly, it's about telling great stories, which engage millions of people every day. And it's not very fashionable to say that television is an exciting thing still, but I believe that, and the statistics indicate it, people are still watching an awful lot of television, and they'll continue to appreciate that storytelling experience. Secondly, television has, over the years, done an awful lot of good. Because it's that mass medium, it's been able to bring things like, this is a Planet Earth, a UK series, be able to bring pictures of amazing wildlife shots to initially people in the UK, but this series was distributed throughout the world. In terms of education, in terms of information, it can be incredibly powerful. The third important thing about television, I think, is that fundamentally it's simple. Fundamentally, the proposition it offers you is, come home at the end of a long day, don't worry about anything, turn it on, perhaps flick some channels, but find something you'd like to watch, sit back and enjoy that. Quite a different experience from browsing the web and trying to find interesting and different stuff. And I think it's an interesting experience, particularly because in this world where we have to interact with more and more things, television potentially offers us a chance to switch off and just be informed or entertained without a lot of faffing about. And it's that simplicity that we were very focused on when we first came to this. So Planet Earth, an amazing series, went throughout the world, but the simplicity angle isn't really holding as true as we might like. So on here are logos of just a few places where you might find the Planet Earth episodes. So it was actually a series that was funded jointly by the BBC, Discovery and NHK. So they were all the launch broadcasters. You end up with a range of on-demand services on which it's available. So BBC iPlayer is something which is promoted now very heavily in the UK. The BBC is also involved in something called Kangaroo, which is going to be a sort of second window on-demand service. So the content is available for 7 days at the BBC, and then it passes into a different rights window, something quite common still in media business models, at which point it's on Kangaroo rather than the BBC iPlayer. In the US, there's a similar arrangement where things are passing through into a site called Hulu that's a joint venture between News Corp and NBC. iTunes is an option that perhaps comes in a little bit after broadcast and offers you a chance to buy it. There is a huge array there of broadcaster logos of people who broadcast these things on their own channels. So many broadcasters in so many countries that it's difficult to even list them, let alone know the difference between SVT and STV or ORF versus YLE. Each of those increasingly, I'm sure, are going to have on-demand services on the web as well as their traditional broadcast services. I put up more BBC channel logos because people will repeat it. There'll be more times to watch it. I put up a logo of the Pirate Bay because whether broadcasters like it or not, they're not going to be the only people distributing this content. And they'll fight a battle against those people, but some of those options will continue to exist. And then most people recognise that after a while, content passes into a copyright-free window. It's a good idea to put it up for archive use, for educational use. The BBC has an archive. Things like the Wayback Machine will look to increasingly archive video content as well as other stuff. And then there's a big picture here, the biggest of the hard drive, because the place where the most of these locations is just on hard drives that are around the place. We've got copies. Sometimes those copies aren't allowed by the broadcaster, but if it's on a PVR, it's perfectly legal in most jurisdictions to record it off-air for your own use and to keep it there. Hard drives are getting bigger. We'll have more and more copies of things locally. So that simplicity that's promised translates technically into an incredibly complicated environment. You end up with hundreds of broadcast places and times, tens of web locations, if not hundreds, numerous versions, an HD version, an SD version. The US version's got Sigourney Weaver on it. The UK version's got David Attenborough on it. Presumably there's a Slovakian version as well. And countless copies of this all around. So the obligatory pictures of cats in a technical presentation, I'm afraid.
Why an obligatory picture of a cat?
People seem to do it more and more now. I couldn't avoid it, I'm afraid. We see an awful lot of hoops that you need to jump through to watch this bloody content. You need to know what time is it. Jump through one hoop. You need to know where you are. The cat's not quite arrived yet, but you need to... is it? Oh, yeah. Go through. I wasn't sure. You need to know if you're in the UK or the US or some other country, because increasingly people will try and use geo-blocking techniques to only make things available in a particular place. You need to know what device you use, because if you use a portable device, probably it only supports certain encodings, whereas a computer will probably be a bit more flexible. And you need to know how you're paying. Do you want to watch the advertising version? Increasingly, if you don't, there's going to be a paid version. If you wanted a paid version, there's probably a good quality one and a less good quality one. There's probably one to own and one to rent. Just incredibly complicated. Each of those represents a hoop that you need to jump through. Fundamentally, when we started all this was, I would like to be able to go home, use a remote control like this, turn on, and find the content. I'd like my user agent to figure out all those hoops for me. It should know where I am. It clearly knows what the time is. I should have told it some simple rules about whether I pay for content or not. I should have told it, or it should know anyway, what encodings it can deal with, and work things out. It's not the only use to watch it on a television, but we felt if we could put a data format in place that was good enough to give you that sort of simple interface, anything else in terms of integrating in a blog or a website was also going to be an awful lot easier. So we set ourselves some quite simple requirements, and I'll come on in a minute, or Lee will, to describing how we're working to satisfy those. First of all, we wanted permanent URIs for a piece of content. The BBC actually do a great job of that. They've now got a website where you can go and find an episode of Planet Earth and it's there, but they're really the first people to do that. And I think even bloggers who might recognise some of these principles of not moving things around often end up rejigging or changing their domain. And we felt that there was a role in making sure that those permanent URIs are provided across a wide range of content, so that then I can say to you, I recommend this show, and pass you a URI, and you can rely that you're going to find something at the end of it, regardless of what time it is. Secondly, we felt that it was vital that you, or more importantly, your user agent, got deterministic behaviour out of that URI. So it would be good to know whether the file is available or not. It would be good to know that it contains the correct version of something that is, really representing what you expected at the end of that URI, isn't obscene in some way, or perhaps as a slightly bigger worry, is it the pre-watershed or the post-watershed version? You want to know that the file plays, i.e. you can download it, and then it's going to work with your kit. And if you've got an HD version, an HD TV, you probably want a very different version from the version that you want on your iPod, and you're going to be pretty irritated if that iPod version tries to scale to your big TV. And finally, really nice in terms of doing interfaces, if you've got nothing more than reliable titles, a little synopsis, and those good links that enable you to skip forward and back between episodes in a series, then you can produce a nice interface. But we set the first two as vital, and the third is really nice in terms of putting together some glue, some infrastructure that pulled all this together. A question I get asked a lot is, so it's a mess, can't we just blame the broadcasters for that? Surely if they just understood a little bit better what the world of the internet was about, and that we just need simple files put up on the website to be used as and when, the world would be a simpler place. I'm always quite keen to emphasise that actually there's some pretty big factors in play for broadcasters here as well. Firstly, as the Writers Guild of America strike indicated, they often don't own all the rights, and they end up doing deals with people like the writers, the cast, the guy that owns the clapperboard, whatever, to rent those rights from them for the content they made rather than buy them outright. And their economic model is all built on renting rights rather than buying it. So often the broadcasters only have the rights for a period and then have to take it down. So they're not in a position to offer a permanent URI where the content can be offered. Secondly, and slightly more complicatedly, actually I think often more difficult to get over, they really care, as organisations, about context. By context I mean, they're used to not only saying we'll make this show, but the show will go at 8 PM, it will have these adverts in the middle of it, it will have these trails for our other shows, and that's the model in which they work. To put it another way, that orange match wasn't special until it was arranged nicely with the pretty array of other matches. And so, organisationally and in terms of their business model, it's quite difficult for broadcasters to move away to a model where they just stick something up there, add a URI, and let other people put the navigation around it. We can have arguments about whether that's a sustainable position or not. But part of this is about trying to help broadcasters who fund the content at the moment to move into a new world where they've still got a model, while creating better interfaces for anyone who wants to build applications. I think another way to look at this is fundamentally we're talking about some information friction that's helped them to keep their models going. It's not easy to jump from I want to watch this episode all the way down through here is an encoding that will work for my hardware in my location at this time, and this is the URI to get it from. And you need to do a bit of work to pull all that stuff together. And I think what we're really about here is reducing that information friction. So the information travels very quickly and very soundly from one place to another, and all of a sudden you've got a world with a lot more opportunities without having to hit up against the barriers. So that's really a quick description of that first section, the environment that we see. I'm going to jump into what we're doing about it, but I'm happy to take questions on that. Happy? We'll jump into some details. So I think good news number one in terms of the friction is that software provides a good amount of grease to get over it. So of course our stuff is built on an awful lot of open source software and open standards. Our stack is Linux, Postgres and Java, and Apache and Tomcat, with an awful lot of Java libraries, and we're spitting out data in XML. It also happens to be RDF. And a lot of what we'd like to say to you now is a bit about why we chose to use RDF and some of our learnings in taking that slightly unusual technical choice. The other good bit of news in terms of reducing that friction is that all that data pretty much exists. It's a case of crawling it and pulling it together, which we felt to be a tractable task. Now, the BBC do a great job of putting it at URIs, and as we'll explain in a minute, actually publishing it increasingly in XML. But here's a moderately complicated example of someone who does none of that work. We've found, as we've looked around and seen how to do this, that if you start from two directions, from Wikipedia up there, and you grab everything from Wikipedia, and you assume that that info box for a television series or a film is pretty well structured, you get the titles of the synopsis and the cast list, and some pretty good URIs for a lot of the series and films around. If you start from another place and you grab the TV schedule, you start to get an idea of what was broadcast when. And we then find it's relatively easy, often by crawling broadcasters' websites, to link that show through to that broadcast time. Because Wikipedia links through to the show on the broadcaster's site, the broadcaster has a time and also a link to their show website. So that link at the top three sections is fairly easy to make. And then finally, often, off-air data provides a missing link, because on many platforms, metadata is broadcast that says, you know what, this episode is part of this broader series, so we can tie the whole thing together. So even in a moderately complicated example, it's possible to pretty reliably pull title, synopsis, cast, content URL of where you can get it from the broadcaster, transmission time and series linkage, and you can put all sorts of stuff on top of that. You can see an easy way, once you've got that far, to add all sorts of other data sources, or maybe to start augmenting files that are on your hard drive with a URL around this, so you can link back to all the data. So the software's largely there, the data's there. We're all about adding a little bit of software on top that pulls it all together in order to make this a reality. So what we're doing, as we said, is three things. We talked quite abstract so far about the aim and what it is, but to get concrete on what technical work we're doing, firstly we're doing a simple design. So it's an XML data format that happens to also be RDF, kind of in the same way that RSS happens to be RDF, but most people don't worry about that. Secondly, an API, which is simply a set of URLs with some guaranteed behaviour at the end of them. Then we're doing a first implementation, a website with an RDF and API interface as well as HTML. And we're doing some first crawlers. What we're going to talk about here is the design and the first implementation. Just as I don't go to the BBC and talk to them about how to make television programmes, I'm not going to come to Google and talk about how to make crawlers either. That would seem like a strange move. I think it's also important to say what we're not doing. This is not part of building our commercial business. We are a startup, but here is a village in Africa. And if I were in that village in Africa thinking about starting a retail business, I think I'd have two options as I looked around me. As I observed that there were no roads either within the village or really to the village, I would probably figure out that infrastructure was needed before I'd have a flourishing retail business. So I could either dump the retail idea and think, hey, I'm going to build some roads and some infrastructure here. Or I could say, you know what, I'm going to join the council, I'm going to get involved in the building of the roads business. And I'm also going to crack on with my retail business, which will flourish as the infrastructure's in place. And that's very much our process. So some examples on things that we're not doing. All the data that we're putting out here is going to be public domain, if we can possibly help it. Some data that we'll pull in will come with an attribution license or something, and we'll have to keep that going. But as far as possible, we want the data to be free for anyone to use. It's not something that only we can use commercially or something like that. Secondly, all the software that we're writing around URIPlay is going to be released via an approved open source license. Thirdly, we're not going to start filing patents or anything like that, and we generally won't do anything else that the community that we're building around this don't like. We're fundamentally about building some infrastructure here, which creates an awful lot of opportunities for us and others to build applications on top. We started from a sort of decidedly mixed bag of existing standards at this point. There's something called TV Anytime, which any of you who've worked in television may well have come across. you ask a TV Anytime expert what the big challenge with TV Anytime is, and they say deciding which bits to implement. I.e., they had a big standards committee, and whenever anyone had an idea, they stuck something in. As far as I'm concerned, the hard bit of a standard is to take things out rather than put it in. So it's a complex view of the broadcasting industry 3 years ago. Doesn't really cover on-demand stuff. Incredibly difficult to figure it all out. We use it as an inspiration when we're trying to figure out how to represent subtitles, but not as a standard that we apply to. The second thing, which is probably even more widely used than TV Anytime, is something called XML-TV. It's a plain old XML standard that describes schedules. Very simple, no on-demand. So again, not really a simple starting point. Lee's going to talk now about what we actually did in order to make this thing work.
Right, so as Chris said, what we're attempting to do, essentially, is provide a service, provide something which allows user agents and devices to understand what content they've got, know where they can get it, make sure that they can get the right version that they're interested in, and basically make the experience for the user as simple as possible. So looking at that, if I break that down into the technical challenges, the first thing that you need to do to be able to do that is have a way of identifying the abstract content that you're dealing with, which is essentially the permanent URIs that Chris was talking about. Secondly, you need to be able to link between those abstract identifiers for video content and URLs where you can get that content on the web. Only once you've done those two things can you start attaching metadata, which is going to help you understand which content you should be accessing at a given time, whether it meets the rights criteria, whether it's the right format for the device that you're showing, that kind of thing. And finally, as Chris said, the intention with this service, with this principle, is that we're not intending to own the data. This is open. We want this to be adopted as widely as possible. And so it's important that services of this kind are able to collaborate. And for that, we need to be able to establish equivalence between metadata that different services have. So in this diagram, what we can see is this is a small part of the BBC Programmes ontology dictionary, if you like, for describing video content. And this is our starting point for describing the terms and the metadata that we're interested in. So you can see from the top going down, you have the concept of a brand, which corresponds to a broader show. So that's not an individual piece of video content, but a group of content which are related to each other. So EastEnders, if you like. Below that, you've got an episode, as it sounds. I mean, so if there's a particular episode of EastEnders which is aired on a particular date, that's your episode concept. Within that, you have versions which correspond to the example Chris gave as pre and post watershed. This is versions, as in different bags of frames, which the creators of the content intended to be distinct for different audiences. And then on top of that, the BBC also attached broadcast dates, which, from our perspective, we're treating similar to locations on the web. It's another way of getting that content. So if you imagine a URIPlay aware device attached to your DVB, then it might be connected to the internet. It might know that it can download it from iPlayer over here, but it might also know that it's on at 4 o'clock on on BBC Two, and so it will treat that as another location for that content. So that's the starting point that the BBC have. Moving on to the next slide. We've added to that the encoding concept, which is an encoding of a version. So if you have something in a certain screen resolution, maybe MPEG-2 encoding versus another encoding with a larger screen size, it allows with that concept included, it allows your device to know which is the most appropriate version to show. And finally, we've then got the location primary concept, which is essentially a URI. It's a location where I can get this particular encoding on the web. as an auxiliary, you've got the policy over there, which is a concept to group the rights information about when this stuff will be available. So an example of a policy might be the iPlayer policy of the BBC, which says you're allowed to watch a piece of content up to 7 days after it was broadcast on the BBC. So that policy information helps your device know when you can get a particular piece of content. The relationship between these concepts is relatively straightforward. A brand has many episodes, an episode has many versions, a version has many encodings, an encoding has many locations. So, to talk about how you go about establishing the identity of a piece of abstract content. For semantic web gurus, this is the process of minting a URI, creating a name for something which is abstract. It may not or doesn't exist in any place that you can go and get. It's just a name for something. Clearly, if you want to be able to talk about video content which appears in many locations and understand that this piece of video content over here is the same as this piece of video content over there, you need to have that common name. With URIPlay, this is the scheme of names that we're creating. You see, it's relatively straightforward. At the top, you've got a breakdown of the primary resources, the brand, the episode, the version, the encoding, the location. Broadcast times appear as a separate URL scheme, and policies as a separate URL scheme as well. URIPlay, sorry. Go.
So the brand here represents like the name of the program.
That's the name of a group of programs.
Name of a group.
Yeah.
Okay. So if different broadcasters have like 10 o'clock news,
Yeah.
they'd have a different brand.
They would have two separate brands. Yeah. So if they both have 10 o'clock news, then they would have to appear at different URLs, URIs, and have different names.
And there's a mechanism in place for.
So when someone has, well, okay. So in terms of where those names come from, there's various options which we would support any of. One, the ideal solution would clearly be that the broadcasters would mint those names themselves, and clearly we've started from the program's ontology that the BBC have created. They're doing a great job of creating names for all of their programs and minting URIs for them and keeping those URIs permanent, saying there they are. At the moment, not many other broadcasters are doing that. In an ideal world, all broadcasters would start doing that, and that would make life very simple. In an even more ideal world, they'd actually start producing them in the same format as well. But maybe that's too much to hope for. So in a world where not all broadcasters are minting URIs for their programs, there needs to be a reliable source where you can get those kinds of names. So that could be URIPlay. If another service springs up which is doing something similar but is not URIPlay, that would also work. As I'll explain when I get onto the RDF section, the principle includes mechanisms which allow you to state that the name I've given for this thing is the same as the name that this person has given for it, so that you can have services coexisting which do the same thing.
There's a very interesting trade-off between having that name as a piece of text that aims to be human readable versus a long number or a bit of hex or whatever. We've decided to go for the human readable one as much as possible on the basis that I think essentially it works all right for Wikipedia, and you end up with a large number of names that are quite sensible, show up very highly in Google. Generally, you look at the link and you know that you're going to get the thing that you expect. You end up with a few, of course, where it ends up being a bit of a mess, and clearly 10 o'clock news risks that because there's going to be many of them and you'll have to put some sort of slightly non-standardised waffle on the end to make it make sense. We don't see this as so much a directory where you find the content you want as once you've found it elsewhere, you follow this link through to get it. So we're not so worried about that effect. And we feel that generally there's quite an advantage in people seeing a nice, easy URL.
I mean, humans aren't going to be typing these URIs
I mean, when we do, it annoys me. And we're doing it in testing, but we don't expect people to actually type it.
So an example also project about Amazon books show quite early in Google searches too, and they have these long GUIs and URLs. So I mean, I don't see any trade-off or advantage either way. It would be an Amazon. As a Google search, they appear to be more useful for me.
Yeah.
The Amazon URLs have the name of the book quite often encoded in it after the.
So there is, I think there's RFC written around 10 years ago by actually one of our bosses. He wrote that for web TV, and this is. Have you seen this? This is RFC where he described the way to URI-based identification of different programs. I think this is US specific, but
is that a broadcast protocol?
No, it's not about broadcast protocol. It's about it's a way to refer to CNN show, for example.
Yeah.
And this is a way to name this. And well, you can look on the web. There are lots of discussion whether this is a good approach or not. And they also discuss in blogs and somewhere around this RFC. They discuss whether someone should use like website URL to identify broadcast or not. So there are different.
RFC 2838. If you're interested.
One thing we should point out is that whilst it's important in principle for broad or video content to have a name, the exact scheme of the name doesn't actually matter. In fact, we've come up with this scheme because we think it's good, we think it's simple and easy to understand. But as might become clear when we move on to the RDF stuff, the actual structure of the name is independent. As long as it is a unique identifier for the resource, it doesn't matter about the structure. And I think one of the things that we anticipate, hopefully, as this service grows up, is that people will contribute ideas as to what the best structure is, and it might change, but it doesn't affect the underlying principle.
So just to clarify, then you've got 3 hierarchies here. Is that right? And
yes,
they're all separate.
One of the things that becomes clear when you start messing around with RDF and metadata like this is that you end up with an awful lot of URIs. So
the point is they exist in 3 separate hierarchies.
They do. Yes. So the top one is the most important. That's the hierarchy of the names for video content. Yeah. The second one is a way of encoding a broadcast time channel broadcaster as a URI, and the last one is a relatively arbitrary naming scheme for the different rights policies.
So what connects the 3 then?
The RDF. So I don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but to just briefly talk about RDF, which is on the next slide.
Okay.
Press the next slide button.
Next slide. Next slide. That was a hint.
Yes. An RDF document is a collection of XML describing a resource, and so what you end up with is a chunk of XML identified by a URI, and it holds a bunch of properties together and says these properties all apply to this resource. So in terms of tying those 3 URIs together, it's the RDF XML document that does it, and we'll see that shortly. So I'll go through what I was going to say for this slide, and then we'll come on to that stuff.
I think it might be worth saying briefly on that second hierarchy. You get no data back when you hit that. Instead, you get a redirect back to the first one. So it's quite a nice, simple interface where you say, you know what, I know the channel I was watching, I know the time that I was watching it, it hits you back to that first one, and then you get a set of RDF.
It's true. The behaviours that you get with these different URIs hopefully will become clear as we go through.
Actually, about that daytime, is that GMT, UTC?
That's the W3 standard for date format. So
it's UTC? Okay.
Yeah. Well, it would be UTC, but there is a field for time zone, so you can specify a time zone if you like.
I mean, precisely. The behaviour that we'd imagine there is if you specify a date time with a time zone, we would then redirect you back to the UTC one, so there's one definitive one, and similarly, if you put seconds or something, we'll get you back to one specific URI, and then that in turn would redirect onto the place where you get the actual data, so the actual episode or version that was playing at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth, in fact, if you go back briefly, it's worth pointing out that on the one hand, you mint a URI, which is the canonical URI for a given resource. But at the same time that you do that, you may also sort of spontaneously cause to exist several aliases for it. So, for example, the example URI that we've got at the top there, the Holby City one, you can see that the episode part of the URI is season number and episode number. In the case where an episode actually has a title, you might have a URI which was brand title, episode title, and the season and episode number version of the URI would be an alias for the same resource. But you'd always have a canonical form, so it would be possible to say, if you put in the season and episode version, it redirects you to the canonical version, so you know which one you're dealing with.
Would you ever have an example of the second existing without the first?
Yes. So in the case of Holby City, I don't believe the episodes actually have titles.
But they have episode numbers.
But they have episode numbers.
Would you ever have one that you associate by time that doesn't have another one identifying it by show and episode or something similar?
Ultimately, something has to have a name when you get right down to it. So if it's hard to imagine a piece of video content that doesn't have a brand that it belongs to at a certain ordinal or a name of any kind.
Yeah, if that happened, for example, that might be that. I'm sure Channel 5's programmes never fall off air, so imagine that's a BBC one. That might be that at that time on BBC One, the programme had fallen off air, so there wasn't any programme going out. Yeah. And then that was dead air, and we'd probably got a name for it internally, dead air, we called it, but it wouldn't be a programme.
At some point, we could probably deal with understanding the various different cases and mapping them to perhaps HTTP codes, or maybe even ending up specifying some stuff back. I expect you could do an intelligent thing with the HTTP codes to think about when you indicate that you don't know, and when you indicate that you know it doesn't exist, for example. Both those bits of knowledge might potentially exist.
So just to clarify, I think you mentioned this already. If I were to hit a URL for 1 minute past 8, you said it would be a clock exactly. Would I get the same program? Because that's it's that program.
Yeah. You first get redirected back to the start time, so you know what the canonical URL is, and then back to the original place. Right. So if you were going to the browser and you just wanted the RDF, your browser would get that after a couple of redirects. Right. If you wanted to access it programmatically, you'd have all the relevant information as well.
That's assuming that we know the duration of the program. One of the things that rapidly becomes clear when we start working with this stuff is that you have to deal with sparse data, and so you have to always deal with the case that you might not know something, especially when, as with this service, the hope is that a community around this will be contributing data to it, and so you have to provide them the flexibility to say, oh, I know when this program starts, but I don't know how long it is, and then if you don't know the duration for it and you ask for something we don't know the answer to, you'll get back an answer which says we don't know.
And you can presumably pick times where there's adverts on, and you wouldn't be logging the adverts. So there's going to be holes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Should we move on to the RDF stuff?
Yeah. So, RDF, Resource Definition Framework, is a technology for describing resources on the web. So it's an obvious design choice whether or not to use it for something like this. In our case, we chose to go with it. At the highest level, really, the choice which makes itself evident is: do you buy into the vision of RDF and the semantic web as a pro? RDF, fundamentally, as a technology, presupposes this idea of the semantic web, where you have lots of semantic web-based services collaborating, and you really gain the most benefits from using it in that kind of environment, versus the con, which is the reputation it has in terms of perceived complexity that it adds. So, what I'd like to talk about briefly is some of those issues of complexity. We go on to the next slide. So, putting the choice another way, do we roll our own XML format for describing all of these things, or do we use RDF to do it? Here's an example of what a home-rolled XML format might look like for some of this stuff. As you can see, very simple. unlikely to scare anybody, which is a good point. The principal concern in terms of it being complex is, we need people to be interacting with this format, and so it might be that we can get over our fears of RDF, but we need people. We don't want to put people off with it. So here's the simple non-scary version. As you can see, brand breaks down into episode, and you can attach additional metadata like titles and whatever to each of those. That gets a little bit more complex when we start adding things like XML namespaces. Slightly more scary, but still quite straightforward. If we then add in, if we make that RDF, so to speak, you can see what it changes to. Essentially, the names of the URI names of the things we're talking about become RDF about attributes, and resources reference each other using RDF attributes as well, RDF about attributes as well, as you can see there. So when we went through this process in terms of the design, we were thinking to ourselves, is it possible to make an RDF format, an RDF schema, which we can use to describe this stuff, as simple or as close to as possible, the simple format that I showed you first. And ultimately we decided that, apart from what looks like a lot of syntactic sugar, we can. Essentially, for developers putting information into the service or taking information out of the service, they have what looks like a slightly more complex format, but ultimately can be treated as that simple underlying format. So, looking in more detail at the metadata we might attach for allowing our user agents to actually make the kinds of decisions that we want them to make, here's a snippet of an example encoding. So this would be contained within its corresponding version and episode and brand. And a user agent might hit the URL for a given episode, receive a fragment of RDF which contains this, and it would tell it that there is an encoding which has the kind of bit rate, the codec in the audio format that you're interested in, and it's available at this location and is restricted by this policy. So if it's within the URIPlay, the iPlayer window for viewing that content, it would know that it could get it from the first location, whereas if it wasn't, it would be able to find an alternative location where it was available. And in each case, it would be able to check the encoding information to find out of the available ones which is the one that's most appropriate for the device that I'm actually going to show it on. So that's all this underlying identification of content and permanent URIs allow this metadata to be delivered to the user agent in a way that they can understand. So, I want to talk a little bit about then what we found by using RDF and what we thought about it. So, in terms of what's good about RDF, it's flexible. It allows you to do the equivalence relations that I talked about. So if you imagine you have two separate RDF documents describing the same resource, for free within RDF, you get the ability to say this description is the same as that description over there. So by creating URIPlay as a service in this using RDF, we're immediately opening the door for anybody else who wants to create an equivalent service, and the two will be able to coexist side by side. You also get the flexibility that people can extend that format. So we're defining some very basic concepts for the intentions we have in terms of making user agents function better. But RDF gives you the capability that someone who might be interested in creating a service that lets people find content with certain actors in them or something like that, would be able to extend the format, publish information in that format, and it would continue to work with our service fine. That's a feature of RDF and its type system. The trade-off for that, of course, is that it's more complex. Your service, unlike with a home-rolled XML format, has to understand a wider range of documents that people might present it with and know how to deal with them, and know how to deal with all the corresponding error cases and things where people say things which don't make any sense. Similarly, that extension feature is enabled by the inference engines, which are essentially built into the RDF model. When you define an RDF schema, you state a type model, you state what properties it has, you state that something is an extension of something else. Whenever you handle an RDF document, you therefore must take the document you've been given and calculate the deductive extension of what the document states, so that you know all of the truths that it's really making, and deal with it that way. So that the fact that that inference is built into RDF enables that. Whereas, but clearly there's a trade-off there, which is that you have to spend that computing time to do the deductive extension each time. And finally, an advantage of RDF is that it is declarative. So people around the web are able to make statements without a large amount of context in terms of what they're using the information for. They can state the information as standalone truths, and it's easy to use it. So that makes it easy for people to make statements about video content around the world, and you can harvest it and use it within URIPlay. The downside to that is that you do have to interpret those statements. So if someone makes a statement that a brand contains certain episodes in one place, and someone makes a statement that a brand contains certain episodes in another place, if you've already uploaded one of those descriptions and you want to upload the next description, you have to know whether you should be removing the ones which are missing, or whether the ones that have been uploaded are just additions to it, or whatever. So you get additional complexity that way. So what does that all translate into? RDF as a technology has been thought about, as I said, in terms of a broader semantic web. RDF is not created as a technology for people who want to publish data. People are already publishing data in their own formats on the web without the aid of RDF. RDF is more about people being able to create services that interact with each other. And as such, there are some differences on how you might go about implementing a service that uses RDF if you're creating a data source, as opposed to one of these bigger search engines or aggregators. So some hints I would give to someone who was thinking about it. One, the first and most important one, would be don't treat your ontology, which is your definition of terms, as configuration data. That is essentially what you would do if you were going to create something like an aggregator, because you don't care about interpreting that data beyond what's stated in the ontology. But when you're creating a data source, reading about RDF, treating the ontology as configuration data is almost a given for most people who talk about RDF, whereas it quickly becomes apparent that really what you want to do is encode that ontology as part of your application. So in our case, it gets incorporated into our data model and pervades the code as opposed to being configuration data. The second is don't try to incorporate everything into your main ontology. It's very tempting to do, to try to state all truths as definitive, whereas it quickly becomes apparent that you want to separate those truths that you are stating as definitive and those which are just appropriate for the application that you happen to be aiming at. So keep those two things distinct. And finally, probably a rule for all software in general, but particularly in this case, keep it simple. It's very easy to end up thinking about all sorts of abstractions whilst you're coming up with your definition of RDF terms. But it's amazing how a small change at that level can lead to a lot of complexity down within the code. Okay, I'm going to hand you back to Chris to finish up.
Okay, so let me make this pretty quick. We've dived deep into the middle bit and how we're doing it and what the design is. there's quite a lot of complexity around using RDF there, but actually once the engine that Lee's been writing is put in place, we've found that your life in terms of crawling, getting data, interpreting what's already there and figuring out what else you need to get becomes much easier. So we feel like we're building a very good and strong centre to this. I want to talk very briefly about how we see that playing into a sort of future world of media distribution. So that's where we are now. We've basically said we're building this service. It's going to feed a range of applications that we can probably all imagine, and probably the best ones haven't even been thought of yet, with some simple data. So right now we're saying BBC and Discovery data feeds into that with some sort of slightly random wiring of crawling the data across and hopefully getting it in better and better formats as it goes on. Maybe we need some Wikipedia stuff. People who distribute content are nice people to know, so maybe we want to pull in some Apple data as well. And you can imagine that diagram quickly gets very complicated in terms of piecing together all the different elements of data. We hope, however, that it's useful to the people with applications and becomes part of the environment, to the point where it's not our ambition to run the main server that does this, it's our ambition to start to create a slightly different world. So maybe rather than just us putting it out, everyone starts to put out data in a format that might look a bit like this or evolves from it that helps you to solve these applications. At that point, all very well, you've got data coming direct from the horse's mouth, but it's a bit complicated for the application provider. So then what you probably do need is a very simple aggregator that pulls it all together and sends it on to the application provider. It's at that point that we hope that we would be able to remove some of the wonky wiring, take a smaller role in the overall thing. And we hope to move towards this world where we start to build some standardisation. Standard is a big word, but we start to contribute to the first stages of standardisation of how you describe television programmes from brand all the way through to encoding and location. That's to the benefit of people who want to build applications.
I'd just like to talk a little bit about what we're doing it quite quickly. So that's Morecambe and Wise, Xmas Special, 1977, most watched TV show ever in Britain. Probably will be the most TV watched show ever in the future, because we had 20 million viewers at a time when there was about 55 million people in the country. At that time, there was 3 channels. We knew all of this, and we knew why people watched telly and how they watched it, mostly by people filling in forms, which incredibly still exists as a way to keep track of how people watch telly. It was simpler then. It was a different era. The Prime Minister once made the BBC delay a different TV show, not Morecambe and Wise, because screening it would affect your election results. So it's kind of not really like that anymore. One of the things we really want to encourage with this is an ecosystem. We want viewers to be able to choose what they want to watch. We want devices to start being able to say, I can do this, I can't do this. We want a world in which people never have to care about codecs. We're trying to encourage devices and web services to interop together. Both large companies like yourselves as well as tiny bedroom companies. We want people to play and get their hands dirty. Some of us at BBC really like free software and standards, and we like helping them because we think that it's going to help us. We don't think we know everything about this. We think we've got a strong understanding of what a major world-class broadcaster needs from this, and we think that perhaps we could get some learning from tiny micro broadcasters, as well as other people that understand how the web fits together. And we see it benefiting us directly in new services which we're going to be producing, which will potentially become incredibly like location and codec and all that aware, so that viewers don't have to be. Really, that's kind of why we're doing it.
So right now we're finalising the first version of this, and as part of that iteration between code and design, figuring out what the URL should be, what the data format should be, and so forth. In 2 weeks, we're really going to move into what we're calling prime time data time, pulling all the stuff in and getting a service that's got quite a lot of information in it. And by the end of May, you should expect to be able to see it and to use it. And hopefully people who are programming applications can start pulling some data in, knowing that it's a pretty stable system to use. And we're definitely keen to have people who've got data or know of a way to get it to stick it into the mix as well. So we're very keen to talk more. We've got a website, we've got a Google group where we're starting to discuss this. These are our email addresses if you'd like to talk more. Happy to take questions.
Okay, so when you define the brand and when you include the episodes in the definition of your brand, does that scale to shows, like The Daily Show, 5 episodes a week, every week for the last 14 years? Don't you end up with a massive definition file? I mean, how does that scale out for shows that run indefinitely? Couldn't you decouple those and say have the definition for the program separate from each individual episode, but have some kind of way of relating the two?
And it might well be necessary to do that over time. To, at the brand URI, give the brand information and links to the most recent episodes. Maybe you end up with a switch at the end of it that says "Give me all" or "Give me the last 5," and then the episode URL just represents the episode.
There's also a lot of shows over time they just evolve, and like Law and Order, they'll replace the entire cast 3 or 4 times over because it just keeps on going perpetually.
In some ways, the brand, that top level, is a black sheep in terms of that definition of terms, because in some ways it's easy to view it as an arbitrary grouping of the underlying episodes, because the episodes are what really correspond to the thing I want to download. The main reason that we include it for 2 reasons. One, it's already part of the BBC ontology, and secondly, in terms of the interface that we'd like to create and the simplicity of that interface, we want people to be able to navigate from the current episode to the next one. And so there has to be some form of grouping that allows you to define what the next one really means. So it's useful to us in that way. But importantly, it's entirely feasible and possible for someone to create an alternate grouping that sits on top. So if you're interested in breaking it down by year or season or something like that, you can do that, and you can layer that on top of what we've got.
Are you interested in how people are going to extend this? Because one of the points about RDF obviously is put your own plugins in, and there seem to be obvious applications for social networking and other bits and pieces for this.
Absolutely.
Are you intending to kind of hang on to some kind of standards for that and encourage people to cooperate better through URIPlay? Are you happy to cast it out to the world and see what happens?
I think that we would probably, and I would like to have a bigger and more serious community in place before making a decision like this. I think that you probably would always expect there to be a leading edge that wasn't part of what we were looking after in our reference implementation or describing on our website. Over time, you probably increase it. So as an example, we don't do anything on cast lists at the moment because it's pretty difficult to represent some of that stuff. But that's a fairly obvious thing, because I think a lot of people would like to say, you know what, I care about anything that's got this director, this actor in it. So that's the sort of thing that people can hang on very quickly and very easily now if they're sort of RDF nerds. But we could extend it beyond that to the next bit. And start doing
for us, for example, I'm told that on the internet there are TV programs available to download in certain areas. That isn't necessarily something that we'd be linking to if they were on torrent sites or whatever, but perhaps we might like the fact that if that was happening, then it would be a nice thing if at least the metadata was correct. So therefore we wouldn't necessarily be running that service, but hey, it's we're providing information about TV shows and then someone else is saying where they exist.
So touching on that, I mean, it seems like the thing that's stopping me watching any program on any time is it's the copyrights, the monetization, it's the rights and so on, which isn't really addressed by this stuff. So this is all about how to find and identify and tag later on children, but I mean, that's the decision is to find out allowed to watch it.
What this does is it respects where there are those rights issues. This respects it, but means that the viewers have to care about it.
Yeah. So I mean, do you see that thing just sorting itself out naturally over the next few years, or are there other things that have to be done to make things more free?
There's definitely more things that can be done. That could be a discussion for the rest of the week. Sure. But I mean, I see this as one part in helping to move to a different world. In terms of, I think one of the things that enables current models is that degree of friction at the moment that means that you haven't got this information on, all right, I want to watch this episode, what are my options? And so if we remove some of that friction, then I think it's one of a number of things that help to promote alternative models.
Didn't Pick21 find when they started to try and do this, but actually the rights management takes over?
In what way?
In Pick21 started off trying to make interoperable ways of finding this for multimedia on the web, and actually realised once you start talking to content providers, they actually care quite deeply about being able to identify stuff that they own and make sure that people are paying for it. And to the sense where it made everyone and Pick21 scope this enormous thing that actually is mostly about rights now rather than finding media.
Which is exactly why we separated it off into a policy thing on the side. And interestingly, because you've got a policy with a URI attached to it, you as an application provider could say, you know what, if you need to specify the stuff that's in that policy, I might as an application provider just ignore that and not even bother to try and pass that policy. I think we've done a half reasonable job of describing the DRM, but given that it tries to do things, some things that kind of defy gravity in terms of revoking keys that you've already given to someone and so forth, it's not possible to think about it hard and define the complete set of restrictions someone might try and apply. So, I mean, common restrictions at the moment are it's available for a bit and then it's taken away again, and that's clearly fairly easy to describe. And then, we apply one of a number of DRM systems to it, which you will need to understand before you can decode that. And it's that sort of level of 5 or 6 parameters that we've described at the moment. I think I agree with you that if it became an incredibly complicated thing, I'd look for a subgroup who actually cared about it to do that stuff.
Okay, I think we should probably wrap up there, but I don't think guys aren't running off straight away, so if you've got a few more questions, I might be around for a few more minutes. Otherwise, let's thank Chris, Lee, and George